Okay, video 3 in this seminar looks at the fusion of law and equity. And the seminar notes have already introduced you to the Supreme Court of Judicature Acts of 1873 and 1875. And these were significant because they resolved the situation in which a case might previously have been brought first in the common law court before recommencing in chancery if a party sought an equitable remedy. And one of the things that this new legislation also made clear was that equitable principles would always take precedence over common law rules if the two sets of rules produced an obviously different outcome in a particular case. So we need to think about what that means, and I'll try and clarify that a little bit. First of all, let's have a look at what the Supreme Court of Judicature Act 1873 said. And section 25, subsection 11 of that act stated that from that point onwards, in all matters in which there's a conflict or variance between the rules of equity and the rules of common law with reference to the same matter, the rules of equity shall prevail. And the effect of this provision is to confirm, beyond all doubt, the supremacy of equity. And the effect of this provision was well illustrated in the case of Walsh and Lonsdale. So Walsh and Lonsdale was a case involving an attempt by a landowner to grant a lease of land to another person. And the defendant in the case agreed in writing to grant the claimant a 7-year lease. In exchange for this 7-year lease, the claimant agreed that the defendant could demand payment of a year's worth of rent in advance. But there was a problem. The claimant and the defendant hadn't used a deed when they entered into the lease. When drawing up the terms of the lease, they needed to record the terms of their agreement in a deed. So to create a legally binding lease of 7 years duration, the parties needed to have used a deed, but they didn't. So the failure to use a deed meant that this agreement couldn't take effect as a legally binding lease. As a consequence of the failure to use a deed, there was no legally binding lease. But despite this failure to use a deed to draw up the transaction, the claimant had still taken possession of the property and had started to pay rent to the defendant. So we've got a situation where the law says there's no legally binding lease, but the claimant and the defendant are acting as if there was a lease. So the defendant then demanded the payment of 1 year's rent in advance because the defendant thought this was part of his contractual entitlement. He thought that because there was a lease in place, he could demand payment of 1 year's rent in advance. The claimant, though, said, there's no legally binding lease. I don't need to pay this. So the claimant refused to pay. In response, the defendant seized control of some of the claimant's personal property, and the value of this personal property was equivalent to 1 year's rent. So the dispute eventually reached the courts because the claimant argued that the defendant wasn't able to do this. The claimant argued that the defendant had acted unlawfully when the defendant seized the claimant's goods. So the issue at stake was whether or not the original agreement could be enforced. Because that original agreement, the written agreement, entitled the defendant to demand a year's rent in advance. By extension, therefore, if the claimant failed to pay, the defendant could seek redress, could seek to recover their loss. So the question was the original agreement enforceable? The original agreement that the parties envisaged, but that they'd failed to put in a deed, could that original agreement be enforced? Well, this is where law and equity differed. So the common law suggested that there was no lease because the parties had not used a deed to execute the agreement. Common law, the defendant had no right to seize the tenant's personal property. The landlord had no right to seize the tenant's property. The defendant had no right to seize the claimant's property, whichever way you want to look at it. So that's the position at common law. The parties had failed to follow the formalities, they'd failed to use a deed, so there was no legally binding agreement. At equity, the position was different. Equity doesn't care so much about formalities, so equity considered that there was a valid 7-year equitable lease, and the defendant had acted lawfully. The equitable lease entitled the defendant to demand the payment of a year's rent in advance and to seize the claimant's personal property in the event of non-payment. So what equity did was to uphold the original agreement. The common law position was that the original agreement could not be binding because it wasn't set out in a deed. But the position at equity was that the original agreement was binding. And the court concluded, basically, that the parties should perform the original agreement because the fact that they hadn't used a deed to record their transaction hadn't altered the terms of the original agreement. And this case is significant because it followed so soon after the Judicature Acts. Remember the point that the Judicature Act says that there is only one court and the equity rules prevail in it. That's what happened in this case. And this case is important because it's a demonstration that these issues could be dealt with in a single court. Because before the Judicature Acts, the claimant would have brought an action against the defendant in the common law courts and won. The claimant was saying that the defendant has seized my goods and they're not entitled to. They'd go to the common law courts, and the common law courts would say there's no legally binding agreement, the defendant's not allowed to do that. But then the defendant would have needed to go to the Court of Chancery to prevent enforcement of the judgment. So there would be two separate sets of proceedings. But what the Judicature Act is doing is avoiding that by fusing the administration of the systems. Both issues, the common law and the equitable issues, could be decided at the same time in the same place. So, to clarify that a little bit more, have a look at the section reading on this in the seminar notes, which considers the fusion of law and equity in more detail.